Seeking Wisdom Week 36, Faith and Loyalty, the Book of Daniel. The Book of Daniel leaves many readers wondering about a marvelous mystery that occurs in the Bible, a book that has 3 languages. A mystery that has never been solved, although there were many theories about the reason for it. According to one theory, chapters 2 to 7 were wrote in Aramaic, the common language in Palestine at that time. Then the work was continued in Hebrew because of the influence aroused by the Macedonian rebellion, or because of the sacredness of the problems in chapters 8 to 12. The author felt the need to use the Hebrew language. The most popular view is that the Book of Daniel was drafted in the 6th century BC, so right around the Babylonian exile. But if you look deeper into the book and look at the history, language, and morality, many scholars believe it was written in the 2nd century BC during the persecution of Emperor Antiochus IV. The first part of Daniel is a collection of 6 short stories about Daniel and his friends. According to these stories, from a young age, Daniel was exiled in Babylon in 606 BC, where he lived with piety and was given the ability by God to interpret dreams and visions. The stories presented fall into 2 categories: stories about loyalty and stories about wisdom. These stories highlight the teaching, by obedience to the law, the believer will conquer enemies and bear witness to mighty God. Part 2 of the book of Daniel, chapters 7 to 12, presents apocalyptic visions in the form of a revelation that was popular from 200 to 100 BC. The apocalyptic writings reveal things the human mind does not understand, and the revelations are presented through the meditation of angels, visions, and symbols. Daniel chapters 7 to 12 encourages those that are suffering persecution under Antiochus IV to be reassured because their time of suffering is coming to an end. These chapters present 4 visions: the vision of the 4 beasts, visions of sheep and goats, Gabriel and 70 weeks, and visions of the Greek wars. Theologically, the book of Daniel gives a rather extensive insight into God's relationship with history in general, particularly the history of the nation and religion of Israel. The focus of the author is God's intervention in history, and the main content focuses on the absolute power of God in all earthly people and events. The areas surrounding Israel in the 2nd century was home to many people that used devotion to gods, idols, or animals to protect their families and other individuals, and the king wanted people to show him the same respect as they did their gods. Because the Israelites lived in this environment, they had an even greater need to uphold and defend monotheism, worshiping only one God. The book of Daniel confirms that when every creature praises the glory of the one and only God, political powers must acknowledge his sovereignty over them, for all authority comes from God. He is the only God, the one in possession of time and history, the one who holds the monopoly on the revelation of the mysteries. Many times in our lessons, we have discussed how God had an influence over history, and this book is no different. The God of Daniel is the one who knows the mysteries and foresaw all the events that will happen in the world. For this reason, the revelation of the innermost mysteries is completely under his authority. In this book, we also read of God's influence and control of history. Every event that happens is not by chance or destiny, but God's eternal purpose. Daniel chapter 4 verses 32 clearly shows this. The Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals and gives it to whom he will. No one dared to question God's authority and ask him what he was doing. The king even had to admit all of the wonderful things that God had done, and ultimately, his power controlled the earthly kingdoms. Allowing kings to rise to power and dethroning them when their pride took over, placing the lowly above others, and giving the kingdom of man to whoever he desires, the people of God. Right in front of the eyes of the great and completely transcendent God, the earthly kingdoms fell from grace one at a time and eventually disappeared. Babylon, Persian, Greek. These once powerful kingdoms eventually give way to the kingdom of God. Many kings ruled these kingdoms, but the ultimate kingship was never held by an ancestor of the lineage of King David, but by the transcendent mystical one who belongs to this world. His kingship is related to that of God, which is eternal in existence. The kingdom of which we speak is the eschatological kingdom, and God will exercise his leadership in the end times. So if you take anything from this book, it should be that 1, God's victory in this world is certain, and 2, that those who faithfully serve God will share victory with him. Finally, how does this book from the Bible serve us in our everyday life? Every time we think of God, we should see him as a source of strength and wisdom. Think about Daniel and his friends. Even though they had not eaten for 3 weeks, were threatened with being thrown into a furnace of blazing fire or the den of a lion, none of them were afraid. They all knew that God would protect them. St. Paul said eloquently, "With God for us, who can be against us? Who can separate us from the love of Christ? In every trial, we triumph entirely through the one who loves us." Thanks to God's enlightenment, Daniel possessed wisdom that surpassed everyone and was able to interpret dreams, explain mysteries, and describe important facets of history. Jesus assured his disciples, "For I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict." Believers received this strength and wisdom through prayer, and it was through prayer that Daniel received the Lord's enlightenment, and through praise to God that Daniel's friends were saved from the furnace. One final point we need to cover is that we all need to be loyal to God in all circumstances. The book of Daniel was written about the people of God who were living under the pressure of the pagan culture, and in each chapter of the book, the people are encouraged to be faithful to God, no matter what is going on around them. The laws that these people lived by may not be relevant today, but the loyalty God so deserves is, and we must all be loyal to God. This loyalty is a concrete expression of our faith. To complete this week's lesson, let's listen to chapter 14 of the book of Daniel. Daniel and the priests of Bel. When King Antiochus was laid to rest with his ancestors, Cyrus the Persian succeeded to his kingdom. Daniel was a companion of the king and was the most honored of all his friends. Now the Babylonians had an idol called Bel, and every day they provided for it 12 bushels of choice flour and 40 sheep and 6 measures of wine. The king revered it and went every day to worship it, but Daniel worshipped his own God. So the king said to him, "Why do you not worship Bel?" He answered, "Because I do not revere idols made with hands, but the living God, who created heaven and earth and was dominion over all living creatures." The king said to him, "Do you not think that Bel is a living God? Do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day?" And Daniel laughed and said, "Do not be deceived, O king, for this thing is only clay inside and bronze outside, and it never ate or drank anything." Then the king was angry and called the priests of Bel and said to them, "If you do not tell me who is eating these provisions, you shall die. But if you prove that Bel is eating them, Daniel shall die, because he has spoken blasphemy against Bel." Daniel said to the king, "Let it be done as you have said." Now there were 70 priests of Bel, besides their wives and children. So the king went with Daniel into the temple of Bel. The priests of Bel said, "See, we are now going outside you yourself, O king. Set out the food and prepare the wine and shut the door and seal it with your signet. When you return in the morning, if you do not find that Bel has eaten it all, we will die." Otherwise, Daniel will, who is telling lies about us." They were unconcerned, for beneath the table they had made a hidden entrance through which they used to go in regularly and consume the provisions. After they had gone out, the king set out the food for Bel. Then Daniel ordered his servants to bring ashes, and they scattered them throughout the whole temple in the presence of the king alone. Then they went out, shut the door, and sealed it with the king's signet, and departed. During the night the priests came as usual with their wives and children, and they ate and drank everything. Early in the morning the king rose and came, and Daniel with him. The king said, "Are the seals unbroken, Daniel?" He answered, "They are unbroken, O king." As soon as the doors were opened, the king looked at the table and shouted in a loud voice, "You are great, O Bel, and in you there is no deceit at all." But Daniel laughed and restrained the king from going on. "Look at the floor," he said. "Look at the floor," he said, "and notice whose footprints these are." The king said, "I see the footprints of men and women and children." Then the king was enraged, and he arrested the priests and their wives and children. They showed him the secret doors through which they used to enter to consume what was on the table. Therefore the king put them to death and gave Bel over to Daniel, who destroyed it and its temple. Daniel kills the dragon. Now in that place there was a great dragon which the Babylonians revered. The king said to Daniel, "You cannot deny that this is a living God, so worship him." Daniel said, "I worship the Lord my God, for he is the living God. But give me permission, O king, and I will kill the dragon without sword or club." The king said, "I give you permission." Then Daniel took pitch, fat, and hair, and boiled them together and made cakes, which he fed to the dragon. The dragon ate them and burst open. Then Daniel said, "See what you have been worshipping?" When the Babylonians heard about it, they were very indignant and conspired against the king, saying, "The king has become a Jew. He has destroyed Bel and killed the dragon and slaughtered the priests." Going to the king, they said, "Hand Daniel over to us, or else we will kill you and your household." The king saw that they were pressing him hard, and under compulsion he handed Daniel over to them. Daniel in the lion's den. They threw Daniel into the lion's den, and he was there for 6 days. There were 7 lions in the den, and every day they had been given 2 human bodies and 2 sheep. But now they were given nothing, so that they would devour Daniel. Now the prophet Habakkuk was in Judea, and he had made a stew and had broken bread into a bowl and was going into the field to take it to the reapers. But the angel of the Lord said to Habakkuk, "Take the food that you have to Babylon, to Daniel in the lion's den." Habakkuk said, "Sir, I have never seen Babylon, and I know nothing about the den." Then the angel of the Lord took him by the crown of his head and carried him by his hair with the speed of the wind. He set him down in Babylon, right over the den. Then Habakkuk shouted, "Daniel, Daniel, take the food that God has sent you." Daniel said, "You have remembered me, O God, and have not forsaken those who love you." So Daniel got up and ate, and the angel of God immediately returned Habakkuk to his own place. On the 7th day the king came to mourn for Daniel. When he came to the den, he looked in, and there sat Daniel. The king shouted with a loud voice, "You are great, O Lord, the God of Daniel, and there is no other besides you." Then he pulled Daniel out and threw into the den those who had attempted his destruction, and they were instantly eaten before his eyes. Thank you for watching. Did you enjoy this week's lesson? If you did, please subscribe to our channel. Next Friday, the new video will be posted on YouTube and Facebook, and the answers to this week's questions will be revealed. Once again, thank you for watching, and we wish you a wonderful weekend full of grace and joy.